The foundation of Islam is, precisely as its name suggests, submission to the reality of the one God, and faith or belief, iman, which of course is faith or belief in the one God. So belief in the one God and submission means recognizing or believing in the one God such that you know you have an obligation to do something about it. You have a duty to somehow live your life in recognition of that truth that you now believe. And so law, I think, in Islam is really a kind of institutionalization of this very personal attitude and this very personal direction that human beings are supposed to take from an Islamic or Quranic, let's say, point of view. So law really is that way of taking this personal attitude and mapping it onto a communal reality. Right? And so it's a way that law was seen as a kind of framework such that a person who submitted themselves to this law would live in a way that would help them cultivate in a deeper and deeper way these two particular attitudes of submission and faith. But it really is faith that is the heart or the center of religion. The Islamic tradition is quite clear that a person who does good works outside of faith, those works don't mean anything, that faith has to be the origin, it has to be the beginning. And there are also indications that faith is a kind of deepening of this outward Islam or submission. There's an interesting, very interesting passage in the Quran where a kind of rough Bedouin in the desert comes to the Prophet Muhammad, and he's decided that he and his tribe are going to join Muhammad. And he comes to him and they say, "We believe." And Muhammad says to him, "No," or he's told to say in the Quran, to tell them, "No, you don't believe yet. You've only submitted. You've submitted, but you're not at that level of belief. You've sort of put yourself in the situation where you're going to outwardly follow the religion, but that belief hasn't entered your heart yet." Okay? So there is this sense that iman or faith or belief is a kind of deepening of that. Now, when we think of faith or belief in common language, right, we think, especially something like faith, right, we say, well, you have to take it on faith. It means to hold something as true, even though you can't see it, you can't prove it, you can't maybe understand it rationally. Faith is something that you believe is true not because you have any intellectual or sensual, physical reason for believing it's true, but simply because you do, right? It's a belief in mysterious things that transcend our normal realms of knowing. And this is very prominent, of course, in the Christian conception of faith, but that's not really what faith and belief is in Islam. It's true that Muslims are told they need to believe in unseen things, that there is an unseen world, right? But for the most part, faith or iman for Muslims, as made quite clear in the Quran, is really a kind of realization of what should be obvious, right? The Quran makes not so much an argument for God, it doesn't make a rational argument for God, but it makes the point that God should be obvious. The existence of God should be obvious to anyone who cares to seriously look. That's the point that the Quran is driving home, and as we'll see, I'll show you some examples of that as we go through. But it's also to come to a realization of something we already know within ourselves. Faith is to realize, to become a faithful person, is to realize something that somehow all human beings already know. Now, in Islamic theological doctrine, they came up with a definition of faith. They said faith is to, the first part is related to this word, this root in Arabic, arafa, which means, as I said, to know. It can be translated as to know, but it's more like to know by realizing or recognizing something. Right? You recognize it is true. You realize that it's true. And it said, faith is, first of all, ma'rifa fil qalb, knowledge in the heart. That's the first thing, knowledge in the heart. Then, affirmation with the tongue, testifying to what you believe. And then, amal bil arkan, acting, doing the good deeds that you're required to do. And those three things constitute faith. But the very first thing, the start of faith, is this idea of ma'rifa, this idea of a kind of knowledge in your heart. So what is that knowledge in your heart that the theologians are talking about when they come up with this description of faith? So I want to look at something of what the Quran says about knowledge in relation to faith. Okay, and this is the first important set of verses. It spans 2 slides. It's kind of a long story, but I thought you probably should see it in its original. Okay, so this is from toward the very beginning of the second surah of the Quran. And when thy Lord said to the angels, I am placing a vicegerent, that's Khalifa. We talked about this idea, Khalifa. A vicegerent upon the earth. They said, wilt thou place therein one who will work corruption and shed blood, while we hymn thy praise and call thee holy, right? So God says to the angels, I'm going to create this person. I'm going to put them on earth. And they say, why on earth would you do that? He's going to cause all of these problems, right? We know that the angels are right. They were very right about this. We hymn your praises. And God's response to them is, I know what you know not. He doesn't say it's not true, but he says, I know what you know not. And he taught Adam the names, all of them. Names are like the realities, right? He taught Adam the names, all of them. Then he laid them before the angels and said, tell me the names of these if you are truthful, and the angels can't do it. The angels don't know. Right? They say, we don't have any knowledge except what you've given to us. So then God calls Adam forward and says, all right, tell them. So tell them. And Adam comes forward, and like a very good pupil who's learned all of the names he's been taught by God, he explains them to the angels, and then God commands the angels to bow down to Adam, and they do, all except Iblis. And Iblis is Satan. So I think this is very significant. This tells us something. This story right at the very beginning of the Quran tells us something about human nature. Number one, we are endowed with knowledge by our nature. Adam stands for the human race. Okay? But it is not a knowledge that we acquire on our own. It's a knowledge that's given by God. God teaches Adam the names. It's very different than the biblical sense. In the biblical sense, Adam names everything in Genesis. But in the Quran, God teaches Adam the names. So on the one hand, all human beings, one can read from this, are endowed somehow with the knowledge of all things, even if it remains only potential in people, in their reality. But it also means that by virtue of this knowledge, human beings are superior to the angels.